All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling language learning, but get this, from the teacher's perspective.
Sounds dry. Trust me, the stuff you sent over, this textbook excerpt, it's got some seriously cool insights about how teachers shape language learning in the classroom.
Yeah, gotta admit, when I first skimmed it, corrective feedback sounded kind of obvious, like teacher hears mistake, corrects it, done. But this excerpt, whole different story.
Totally. It's way more nuanced than just right or wrong. Researchers actually have this whole system, a taxonomy of how teachers correct errors. Fascinating stuff.
Okay, hit me with it. What kind of categories are we talking about here?
So you've got your very direct approaches, like explicit correction. Imagine a student saying, "The dog run fast." The teacher would directly point out the error. It's ran, not runned.
No confusion there, straight to the point.
Exactly. Then there are things like recasts, which honestly are super common. That's where the teacher subtly corrects the student without making a big deal out of it. So, oh, the dog ran fast?
Smooth save, like they're sneaking in the learning.
Right. And it gets even more indirect. You've got clarification requests, like, can you say that again?
Yeah.
Prompting the student to self-correct. Or metalinguistic feedback.
Hold on, metalinguistic feedback. Gonna need a translation for that one.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
It's basically giving clues about the grammar without just giving the answer away. Instead of use the past tense, the teacher might say, "What happened yesterday?" Gets them thinking.
Ah, so it's more about guiding them towards the answer than just handing it over. Clever. But okay, we've got this whole smorgasbord of corrective feedback techniques. What really got me thinking was the stuff about recasts. They seem so natural, so effortless. But the excerpt, it kind of hinted that they might not always be the most effective way to go, especially in certain situations.
Yeah, you're picking up on something important there. There's a lot of debate about recasts. They're super common in classrooms that are more about the subject matter than perfect grammar. Think history class, for example. The teacher's trying to cover a ton of material, so they might use recasts to subtly correct language without derailing the lesson.
Makes sense, but are the students even picking up on those corrections?
That, my friend, is the million-dollar question.
And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because it all comes down to whether the student even notices the correction in the first place. If they're busy trying to absorb a lecture about, say, the French Revolution, are they really going to clock that tiny grammar tweak?
You're exactly right. And that brings us to the heart of what's sometimes called the recast debate. Do students even register those subtle corrections? Or are they so focused on the content that the grammar just flies over their heads? That's what we'll be unpacking next.
So we're really digging into this whole recast debate, huh? It's making me rethink everything I thought I knew about learning languages.
It's a tricky one, right? On the one hand, recasts just seem so, I don't know, natural. You're slipping in the correct way to say it without making a big fuss. But then again, if the student's not even aware they're being corrected, how's that learning supposed to happen?
It's like, imagine trying to learn how to, dance just by watching someone else do it perfectly. They never point out your mistakes. You just keep going, totally clueless.
And you know what? The research actually supports that. There's this one study, they found that in classrooms where the main focus is on the content itself, like history or science, recasts, they were the least likely type of correction to actually be noticed by students.
Okay, so that's 1 point for team. Recasts are useless, but I have a feeling it's not that cut and dry, right? What about in those classrooms where language learning is the main event?
You're onto something. Context is key. A couple of other studies found that students were way more likely to pick up on recasts in classrooms where there was a bigger emphasis on actually getting the language right, the nitty-gritty of grammar and all that.
So, in an ESL class, where everyone's already tuned in to the ins and outs of the language, recasts might actually be a helpful tool in the teacher's toolbox.
Exactly. It all boils down to whether the learner is in the right headspace to catch those subtle cues. And you know what this points to? A much bigger idea about how we learn in general. It's not just about being exposed to the right way to do something. It's about actually grappling with it, engaging with it.
Okay, hold on. Got to write that down. Active engagement, not just exposure. Go on. You're on a roll.
I mean, think about it. Have you ever had someone explain a new word to you and you're like, yep, got it. But then 2 seconds later, poof, gone.
Ugh, all the time. It's like that information just vanishes into thin air.
Right. Totally passive. But if you actually take the time to look it up yourself, write it down, use it in a sentence, that's when it sticks.
So it's not enough for the teacher to just say the correct thing. The student has to actually notice the mistake, process the correction, and ideally even try to use it themselves. Otherwise, it's just like that forgotten vocabulary word here 1 minute, gone the next.
You got it. And this leads us to another super interesting thing about how teachers and students interact in the classroom. Asking questions.
Oh, the humble question. Seems so simple, but in the hands of a skilled teacher, it can really get those wheels turning, spark some amazing discussions.
Couldn't have put it better myself.
Yeah.
But just like with those corrective feedback techniques we were talking about, there are tons of different ways to ask questions, each with its own strengths and, well, potential downsides too.
Okay, before we dive too deep into that, let's start with the basics. Back in my school days, there was always this clear difference between display questions and genuine questions.
Ah, the classic dichotomy.
Right. Display questions are those ones where the teacher already knows the answer. They're testing you, basically. And then you've got genuine questions, which are all about exploring new ideas, getting different perspectives.
Which often leads to more authentic learning experiences. But here's the catch. This textbook, it actually challenges the idea that display questions are always a bad thing.
Wait, really? Now you've got my attention.
Yeah. One of the studies found that when teachers use display questions strategically, they can actually be super effective as a scaffolding tool.
Scaffolding, like the kind they put up around buildings under construction?
Exactly. It's about providing that temporary support to help learners reach a higher level of understanding. Instead of just launching into a super complex topic, the teacher might use a series of display questions to break it down into smaller, more manageable pieces.
So it's like building a bridge from what the student already knows to what they need to learn.
Exactly. Each question acts like a stepping stone, guiding them closer and closer to that aha moment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. It's not necessarily about the type of question, but how it's used. You know what else I remember from my classroom days? That super awkward silence after the teacher asks a question.
Ah, yes, wait time, or the lack thereof.
Like the air gets sucked right out of the room and everyone's trying to avoid eye contact, praying they don't get called on.
Oh, we've all been there. But here's the thing. Research has actually shown that the amount of time a teacher waits after asking a question, even if it's just a few seconds, can have a massive impact on how well students respond.
Really? I always figured most teachers would just get impatient with the silence and either answer it themselves or move on to someone else.
It's a tough balance to strike, for sure. But there are studies that show giving students more time to think things through, gather their thoughts, and work up the courage to actually answer.
Leads to deeper learning and more interesting discussions overall.
You got it.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? Like, even a couple of seconds of quiet can make such a big difference. But I gotta say, with all this cool stuff we've uncovered about recast and asking questions and wait time and all that, I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of what makes language learning really click, you know?
I know, right? It's like we've been so focused on these specific techniques, these little pieces of the puzzle, that we've forgotten about the bigger picture. And that's actually where this textbook takes us next. It introduces this whole other layer to the conversation, something called ethnography in education.
Ethnography. Okay, full disclosure, I've definitely heard that word thrown around before. But could you refresh my memory on exactly what it means again?
Basically, it's about looking at the whole context of where language learning happens. Instead of just zeroing in on, like, how many times a teacher recasts something, ethnography tries to understand the whole cultural and social world of the classroom.
So instead of just watching what's happening on the surface, we're diving deeper, figuring out what's really driving things beneath.
Exactly. It's about understanding how things like cultural norms, what's going on in families, even political stuff, how all of that can influence a student's experience with language and whether they're even open to learning.
Okay, now you're speaking my language.
Yeah.
Got any juicy examples from the textbook that really bring this to life?
Oh, yeah, definitely. One that really stuck with me was this study about language learning among kids in the Solomon Islands. At first, the researchers went in thinking, okay, these kids are struggling because of language barriers. They speak something different at home. But they spent time actually observing the community, talking to families, and they realized it was way more complicated than that.
What else was going on?
Well, they found out that a lot of these kids were getting messages from their families like, school's not that important, or our native language and traditions matter more. Many of the parents had had bad experiences in the education system themselves, and those beliefs were, like, trickling down to their kids.
Wow, it really hits home that language learning isn't happening in some bubble, you know? It's all tangled up with who we are, what we believe in, our hopes and fears, the whole shebang.
Exactly. And that's why this whole ethnographic perspective is so powerful. It helps us see past those simple explanations and appreciate how complex everything really is.
2 thumbs up for the fascinating ethnographic studies. What else did the textbook dig into?
Well, there was another study, this time from Canada, about the experiences of ESL students in regular classrooms. And what they found was that even small, seemingly insignificant things teachers were doing could actually be sending messages to these students that they weren't even aware of.
Okay, I'm all ears. What kind of things are we talking about?
One example was where the ESL students were sitting. They noticed that these students were always placed closer to the teacher's desk, often kind of separate from the other kids. On the surface, it seemed logical, right? Closer to the teacher, more support. But for these students, it often backfired.
It's like that saying, out of sight, out of mind. They might be physically closer to the teacher, but they end up feeling left out from the rest of the class.
Exactly. And that feeling of isolation, that I don't belong here vibe, can totally sabotage language learning.
Okay, that's 2 for 2 on the fascinating ethnographic studies. Don't hold out on me. What else did this textbook have in store?
The last one I'll share takes us to Hungary. Researchers wanted to see how the fall of communism actually impacted language learning. Might seem like a weird connection to make, but remember, ethnography is all about understanding those bigger societal forces at play, right?
You've definitely got my attention. How did the fall of communism affect things in the classroom?
So before the fall of communism, classrooms were very, rigid. Teachers always in control, lots of memorization, grammar drills, not a lot of space for creativity or actually using the language in a real way.
I can practically hear the pencils scratching. Not exactly the most inspiring environment, huh?
Right. But after the fall of communism, there was this huge shift. Teachers were encouraged to ditch that old school approach and try things that were more communicative, more student-centered.
So instead of just memorizing verb tables, students were actually getting to use the language, have conversations, and actually say something.
Exactly. And guess what? The researchers found that this change in how teachers were teaching had a huge positive impact on how well students learned the language. They were more into it, they were speaking more fluently, and they felt more confident using the language in real life.
That's wild. Who would have thought a political revolution could actually lead to such a positive change in the classroom? This whole deep dive has really been eye-opening. It's incredible how much more there is to language learning than just memorizing words and grammar rules.
I know, it's amazing, right? It's about connecting with people, understanding different cultures, and appreciating how everything influences how we learn and communicate.
It really makes you wonder what other hidden connections are out there just waiting to be discovered. And that, my friends, is the beauty of a good deep dive. It's not just about getting answers. It's about asking those thought-provoking questions, challenging what we think we know, and embracing the beautiful complexity of the world around us. So here's a little something to ponder as we wrap up. We've talked a lot about how teachers can use these insights to create better learning environments, but what about us as learners? How can we take this knowledge and apply it to our own language learning adventures, whether we're just picking up a few phrases for a trip or diving headfirst into a whole new language? Food for thought. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.